Fantastic, thank you, Rob. We're recording this lecture as well, so just in case anyone who missed us because we were a bit late, we'll be able to catch up on that. Anyway, without any further delay or ado, I will introduce tonight's speaker, who is Danica Ramsey-Brimberg. She was a doctoral student at the University of Liverpool in their history department and undertook a thesis which I have a feeling will feed into her talk tonight quite extensively on Viking and ecclesiastical interactions in the Irish Sea area in the 9th to 11th centuries. She is now one of our new assistant editors for the journal Church Archaeology. So we are doubly grateful for her presence. And tonight she's going to be talking about revisiting Viking Age graves from ecclesiastical and non-ecclesiastical context in the Irish Sea area. So I will hand over to Danica if you'd like to share your screen. We haven't had a chance to practice this, so do bear with us. And hopefully she'll be able to take it from here. Absolutely fantastic.
There we go.
That's perfect, Danica. Thanks very much.
So I'd like to thank the Society for Church Archaeology for having me speak, and for everyone attending this lecture virtually and for staying on. Please also, I'd like to, before I begin, please accept my apologies for any mispronunciations, particularly of place names. In the antiquarian past, and still in popular culture, the Viking Age and the Church are still often posited as being at odds with each other, and graves with grave goods from the Viking Age are often described or portrayed as pagan and or heathen, and as being anathema to Christian burial practices. While academia has in some ways come a long way from this portrayal, the known evidence of the complex relationship between Viking Age settlers and the Church has not yet been explored to its full extent. Relations between the clergy and the laity during the Viking Age are actually far more complicated, with variations occurring depending upon a number of factors. In some instances, this resulted in placement in or near ecclesiastical sites, while others were situated in clearly non-ecclesiastical contexts. My research is primarily focused on the former, and while investigating, I was intrigued to see whether the local and regional, official and unofficial guidelines were present in the latter as well. I have sought to analyze not just their similarities and differences, but their situation within the larger environment of the Irish Sea area. But before I continue, I want to clarify that this is a work in progress. Many of my findings are only preliminary and may evolve as the investigation continues. The Viking Age is the period in which individuals from Scandinavia or of Scandinavian descent or association travel to and around areas within and outside of Scandinavia, from Iceland to Iran. The period has been typically described as being 793 CE, the attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of northeast England, to 1066, the Battle of Hastings, which saw the beginning of the Norman invasion in England. However, these dates are merely arbitrary, depending upon geographic areas, such as with the Isle of Man, parts of Scotland, and Iceland, where Scandinavian descended rulership extended long afterwards. A diaspora occurred in which not just people moved, but objects, ideas, beliefs, and practices were transferred directly, not just from Scandinavia, but other areas of the Viking Age world as well. This included the Irish Sea area. The Irish Sea area comprises the modern day areas of Southwest Scotland, Northwest England, Western Wales, the Isle of Man, and Eastern Ireland. While the sea has no specific boundaries, the North Channel provides an approximate northernmost limit, while the St. George's Channel provides the southernmost. For the purposes of my research, I defined the eastern and western perimeters as being about 30 kilometers, or a day's journey inland, to provide a focus on areas closer to the coast around the Irish Sea. While contact around the Irish Sea area has been established as dating back to the Neolithic period, The Viking Age was a particularly interconnected period in which groups of people were traveling to raid, to settle both temporarily and permanently, to go on pilgrimage, to have in political and diplomatic meetings, to flee in exile, to rule, etc. Regardless of their motivations, this would have facilitated contact, even in passing, between local inhabitants and those of Scandinavian origin, descent, or association. Therefore, interactions of some kind, positive, negative, and neutral, would have occurred, leading to a variety of burial practices and decisions that embody the diversity of Viking Age settlement. Before I continue, I'd like to, 3 definitions need to be established. The Christian burial grave is typically an inhumation containing no grave goods, oriented east to west, placed supine or on their back, in simple stone-lined, wooden, or earth-cut graves in Christian cemeteries. However, exceptions exist to this rule throughout the early medieval world, with different practices being considered, permitted, or at least tolerated, depending upon the political or economic circumstances. A Scandinavian pagan burial grave is typically an inhumation or a cremation that utilized different practices and varied not just regionally, but locally in Scandinavia, as well as elsewhere. Grave goods such as small artifacts, so tools, jewelry, weapons, vehicles, livestock, and even slaves could be included, and graves could be constructed from earth cuts to more elaborate structures using boats, ships, carts, or chambers. As a result, elements of each location's practices could overlap with that of a Christian burial. A Viking Age furnished burial is an inhumation, though cremation remains a possibility, containing grave goods from the Viking Age and therefore differs from typical Christian graves, but it's not necessarily Scandinavian or pagan. If the lines between all 3 sound a bit blurred, that's my intention. While researchers can determine how a grave can be likely classified, ambiguity exists, as conversion was not a final, life-altering act, and Christianization could be a long, meandering, and often hazy process. The line between Christian and pagan is blurred and hard to distinguish. This means that my research tends to focus not on what these people were, but how they and their kin decided to portray their power, wealth, and status. Meanwhile, just in case, the definition of ecclesiastical site for my purposes will be used to denote a site belonging to or connected with the Christian religion as defined in the Cambridge Dictionary. Therefore, I've used a more elastic term so as to accommodate the ambiguity with which some of my possible ecclesiastical sites have in the accompaniment of a church. Ecclesiastical landscape has been used similarly, whereas church landscape denotes a church and its surrounding area. And Christian landscape is anywhere associated with the Christian faith. When an ecclesiastical site may include a church landscape and cover an ecclesiastical landscape, any place in the Irish Sea area could be in the Christian landscape, including Viking Age graves situated distinctly away from church-associated cemeteries. Limitations do persist with the research. Many of the graves were found by accident in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries during the construction of buildings and railroads, and graves were often damaged in the process. This could even happen when excavation happened, as was the case with Croton Aaron, County Meath in Ireland. While what was left of the Viking Age grave was not destroyed, a Bronze Age funerary urn was shattered by a spade. Little information could also be recorded by or passed on to antiquarians or antiquarian societies, particularly regarding skeletal remains and the construction and location of the burials. For example, both Viking Age furnished graves at Kirkmuckle on the Isle of Man only have details of their composition and approximate placement. Details about who they were buried with remains unknown. This is also partially due to preservation before the uncovery of the grave, as the type of soil can prevent or accelerate decomposition. As regards information more generally about the burial's context, more information is available for those located at ecclesiastical sites, particularly if they were recorded historically, have sculpture, or have been excavated. However, place names, natural features, and other elements can be utilized to provide some details regarding the placement of graves in non-ecclesiastical contexts. Overall, my data derives from 61 sites, separating those at Kilmainham in Ireland into two groups, those affiliated with Kilmainham the monastery and those that are separate, as well as at least 147 known graves with grave goods. More may exist in the Irish Sea area, and the way in which the Kilmainham and Island Bridge material, both from Ireland, were initially recorded means that only a minimum number of graves could be approximated. Overall, these graves are in different parts of the Irish Sea area and located both in rural and urban settings, and range from cemeteries, both secular and church associated, to singular entities. To study these burials, I had two key questions. How did Viking Age graves with grave goods in non-ecclesiastical contexts compare to those in ecclesiastical contexts? And the second is, in light of recent evaluations of Christian graves, deviant graves, and ecclesiastically located Viking Age furnished graves, can all of these graves be wholly considered to be Scandinavian pagan graves, or are some of them similarly complex entities, or all of them? Similar comparative studies have been completed. Two key examples are Stephen Harrison's 2008 doctoral thesis, Furnished Insular Scandinavian Burial Artifacts and Landscape in the Early Viking Age, and Caroline Patterson's chapter, A Tale of Two Cemeteries, Viking Burials at Cumwhitton and Carlisle, Cumbria. My research complements and builds upon their methodological approach to graves with grave goods from the Viking Age, creating an in-between study that focuses on a region and the local variations within it. In an attempt to answer these questions, I'm looking closely at each site individually for its different features, and then conducting a broader statistical analysis, comparing the sites along 4 different points: their date, their grave construction, their grave goods, and their grave location. Within these categories, I'm breaking down them even further. While this is not an exhaustive analysis, it covers the core of the evidence. Particularly, a number of graves were recorded with only vague details regarding the skeletal remains, if they were noted at all. Sources from multiple disciplines have been utilized, including archaeology, texts, geography, place names, and art history. Although the amount of information is often site dependent, by bringing together different types of evidence, they complement each other and often reveal more than when used on their own. One of the 3 areas in which the Irish Sea area has been divided into is the Western Irish Sea Zone, which is comprised of modern-day Northern Ireland and Ireland. Going into the complete history of the Viking Age in Ireland would require the complete focus of several lectures, and has already been discussed in more detail by scholars such as Claire Downham and Nancy Edwards. I will only share with you a brief overview, much akin to my description of the Viking Age from before. While the Irish annals first refer to the Atlantic archipelago being attacked in 794, the first attack, according to the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of Clonmacnoise, and the Annals of the Four Masters, was in 795 on Recru, which has been equally associated with Rathlin Island off the coast of County Antrim and Lambay Island off the coast of County Dublin. Meanwhile, the Annals of Innisfallen record in 795 that Inishmurray, County Sligo, and Inishbofin, County Galway, were raided alongside Iona in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland, which lies just north of the Irish Sea area. While raiding continued, wintering began in 841, with permanent settlements occurring shortly afterwards. Individuals became allies and mercenaries of the Irish kings, as well as traders, craftspeople, and farmers, adding to the diversity of Ireland and becoming a part of the dynastic feuds and fighting already in Ireland. This can be seen with the brief expulsion from 902 to 917 of Hiberno-Scandinavian leaders from Dublin. Viking Age rulership continued until about 980, when Melsechnaill, High King of Ireland, defeated Anlave Curan, King of Dublin and former King of York, at the Battle of Tara and Siege of Dublin. Despite their political control waning, their influence remained within Ireland culturally, economically, and linguistically. Within Ireland and Northern Ireland, 37 Viking Age graves were located at 10 ecclesiastical sites. Of these, at least 35 of these graves and 8 of these sites were located in County Dublin. Meanwhile, at least 48 Viking Age graves were located at 12 non-ecclesiastical sites, and 38 of the graves and 7 of the sites were located in County Dublin. While the majority of these located in County Dublin derived from parts of Kilmainham, in the case of the ecclesiastical sites, and Island Bridge, Inchicore, and the other parts of Kilmainham for the non-ecclesiastical sites, a high propensity of the sites can be tied to Hiberno-Scandinavian control of the town of Dublin and of the surrounding rural area around it, known as the De Fliniskerry. Within this area, a number of ecclesiastical sites, both churches and monasteries, were built prior to and during the Viking Age, and many of these feature Viking Age furnished graves, either in their associated cemeteries or at their periphery. At the same time, other individuals and their kin were making decidedly different choices, associating themselves with other prominent elements in the political, social, and natural landscape. Yet, this is what appears on the surface. When taking into account the different types of sites chosen or created, the sites can be divided into 5 categories that reflect the variety of burial sites already present in Ireland and Northern Ireland at this time. In each of these cases, the deceased and their kin were trying to make a statement as to their power, wealth, and status, drawing upon acceptable burial practices in their area, while also using their own signifiers derived from their country of origin or that of their ancestors or associates. The first category is ecclesiastical sites. These include St. John's Point, County Down, Athlumi, County Meath, Finglas, County Dublin, Phoenix Park, Dublin, County Dublin, Bully's Acre, the central and southern areas of Kilmainham, Church of St. Michael le Pole, Bride Street, and South Great George Street. They are all locations in which an ecclesiastical site of some kind, chapel, church, monastery, or ecclesiastical complex, has been described either in the textual or archaeological record as being founded prior to or during the Viking Age, making them concurrent. In addition to these Viking Age furnished graves, most of the ecclesiastical sites, except for Athlumi, Finglas, and Phoenix Park, have early medieval unfurnished graves, highlighting a chosen association with church-associated cemeteries, and more broadly, the church. Many of the graves were located within the confines of the ecclesiastical site, but a larger number were actually located at the boundary, either just inside or just outside. While the ecclesiastical boundaries could have been expanded or contracted over time, these graves trod a literal and metaphorical boundary that is often reflected in the construction of the graves. With the exception of the grave goods, their construction reflected that of their unfurnished counterparts. Even when their orientations varied due to the man-made or natural landscape, this can also be seen in graves in church-associated cemeteries. The second category are possible ecclesiastical sites that alternatively may be secular cemeteries. These include Parnell Square, County Dublin, which is in Dublin itself, and Donnybrook, County Dublin. While both have cemeteries in which furnished and unfurnished graves are present, the presence of early medieval ecclesiastical sites are unclear. With regards to Parnell Square, taking into consideration a dubious reference to the foundation date of 948 and a possible now lost early 10th century portion of the Annals of St. Mary's, most documentation suggests an 11th or 12th century foundation with affiliations to various religious orders that ended in 1539. A predecessor may have existed in light of the location, reflecting more Benedictine, so about the 9th century, than Cistercian foundation, and the gift of lands in an 1171 royal charter, gaining rights no other religious houses or people had in Dublin. However, the current archaeological evidence suggests a 12th to 14th century date, including a 1718 rediscovery of a leaded coffin containing the body of a bishop in full pontificals. which has been thought possibly maybe being a 13th century archbishop who had retired to the abbey. Despite the tenuous suggestion of a 5th or 7th century foundation, the place name of Donnybrook or Domhnach is from Dominicum or Dominica, the Lord's Day or Sunday. Most names with Domhnach in their names were founded between the 7th and 10th centuries as free churches of status or mother churches and were critical in pastoral care. These were found throughout Ireland, although a notable cluster is near Dublin. There were often familial churches supported by a local lord, but did not have a permanent cleric. Although some are associated with an ascetic heirloom or a founding state, or even perhaps a small monastic community in some cases. The second half of the name, the dedication, Brock, has three possibilities. St. Brock, an 8th century abbess with a holy well dedicated to her, or the second saint, St. Moby, who the well might be dedicated to her as well. They're not quite sure. St. Moby was a nun who died in the 6th century and lived in the convent. And then the last possibility is Badgers. Despite local legend and an 8th or 9th century granite base for a wooden cross, no evidence exists of the convent being at Donnybrook graveyard. Although the presence of a church remains only a possibility, the presence of 3 Viking Age furnished graves at Parnell Square and 2 at Donnybrook amidst similar unfurnished graves suggests some level of negotiation and knowledge of local burial practices and perspectives on power, wealth, and status. 2 groups of Viking Age graves, those located at College Green, Dublin, County Dublin, and Inchicore, Dublin, have also evidence of unfurnished graves, but do not appear to have even a tentative association with the church. In the case of College Green, only one unfurnished grave is present, originally described as black marble, the likely material being limestone. The grave was under a small hill oriented northeast to southwest and was of a probable early medieval date. This early medieval grave, as well as the Viking Age graves, were all inhumations. The other 2 graves at the site appear to date to the Bronze Age, one consisting of a Bronze Age urn with bones and another being composed of 2 bronze flat axes. In the case of Inchicore, 6 Viking Age graves with grave goods were placed in a small cemetery of unfurnished graves that were rows from east to west orientation. While possibly pre-existing, they have also been concurrent, and regardless, those interring the deceased individuals would have been aware of the cemetery, particularly as they did not appear to disturb other graves. While some of the Viking Age graves were of a north-south or south-north orientation, one of them was of an east-west orientation. With both College Green and Inchicore, unfurnished graves may be those of Scandinavian origin or descent, but they may equally be those of Irish origin or Hiberno-Scandinavian origin, suggesting that individuals were burying different types of graves together, even in non-ecclesiastical complexes. However, in 2 cases, the opposite appears to be the case. Unlike the central and southern zones of the Kilmainham complex, which are associated with Kilmainham, the eastern zone, like Island Bridge, appear to be distinct and separate entities based upon their proximity away from the monastery of Kilmainham, but also because they appear to only feature graves with grave goods. Those considered to be in the central zone are located right within the boundaries of Kilmainham, while those in the southern zone are right on the projected boundary and were located either just inside or just outside. However, those in the eastern zone were closer to the settlement of Dublin, and those at Island Bridge were further inland on the other side of the monastic complex. They appear to represent 2 separate cemeteries that actively chose not to be buried among unfurnished graves in any ecclesiastical context. Like the burials located within the settlement of Dublin itself, the high concentrated population would have meant that burials themselves would have been concentrated and in their collective groups, and therefore located relatively near each other, but not necessarily directly associated with each other. An active decision was therefore made as to placement. That is not to say that unfurnished graves may have existed. Details regarding the archaeological finds are fragmentary, but if there were unfurnished graves, they would have likely been mentioned even in passing, like their monastic associated counterparts. Isolated Viking Age graves with grave goods consist the majority of burials in non-ecclesiastical contexts. These include Ballyholme, County Down, Barnholm, County Kildare, Dollymount, County Dublin, Kildare Street in Dublin, Cork Street in Dublin, Croagh Erin, County Meath, Wimmera, County Wicklow, and then a location that is somewhere between 3 Mile Water and Arklow in County Leinster. Located equally inside and outside of County Dublin, they highlight the spread of graves across the east coast of Ireland and Northern Ireland, but also the variety of items with which graves could be buried. They range from an insular bowl and textiles to swords, but in each case, the number of grave goods were kept to a singular object. The exceptions are the grave at Ballyholme, County Down, in which there were 2 oval brooches, undyed wool, and linen and tabby weave cloths. The grave at Barnhall, County Kildare, which held a small iron axe head and metal fragments, and the grave between 3 Mile Water and Arklow, County Leinster, which had 2 oval brooches and a chain. While they may have been derived from non-ecclesiastical contexts, they were nearly all earthen graves, and Ballyholme was the most elaborate, and that was a charcoal grave in a natural or man-made mound. Charcoal graves have been noted elsewhere in church-associated burials in Ireland, Scotland, and England, as well as Viking Age furnished graves, including one at St. Peter's Church and St. Patrick's Chapel in Heysham, Lancashire, and one at Conkenhow on the Isle of Man. Now, once again, I'd like to reiterate, placement in ecclesiastical contexts or non-ecclesiastical contexts is neither a sign of conversion or Christianization, nor a sign of pagan beliefs. Rather, it is an indication of alignment with a particular group's signifier of power, wealth, and status. In regard to the aforementioned College Green burials, the graves with grave goods and the grave without grave goods were located around the Hoj, which derives from the Old Norse word for mound, which is quite possibly the site of the Thingmont, or Thing, the Viking Age political assembly place. This parallels other sites, such as Tynwald on the Isle of Man, although in that instance, the mound was also associated with the Church of St. John and located within its boundaries. Therefore, different ideas need to be considered, including those of the pre-existing population in Ireland and Northern Ireland. The reason for dividing these graves in Ireland into these 5 categories is to highlight the various contexts within which Viking Age graves with grave goods could be placed, but to also underscore that most of these contexts have a firm basis and acceptable burial locations for Irish burials. With the legislation of consecrated ground in the 9th century and widespread enforcement by the 10th century in Ireland, burial at church-associated cemeteries was considered a place of significance and therefore designated for certain individuals who met specific requirements. However, the texts deriving from Ireland that would have been studied reveal a far more complex picture. The early 8th century Irish Collectio Canonum Hibernicis, with elements from earlier sources, was the first canonical text in the Latin West to contain laws not just for clerics, but for the laity as well. It's also the first known religious text in Ireland to legislate who was allowed to be buried in a particular location. While promoting burial in familial cemeteries, a primary emphasis was given within canonical law towards church-associated cemeteries. In the Collectio Canonum Hibernicis, a lay individual was required to be buried in an ancestral cemetery or at a church, with greater emphasis on the latter, and a monk was required to be buried at the church to which he was affiliated. Other canons state that not to be buried at these locations would have marked the person as cursed, and to retain another group's monk would have been a sin not just for the individual, but the whole residence. As such, boundaries, even arbitrary ones, were necessary in order to provide a distinction between those worthy of burial and those who were not. These burials extended to both the virtuous and the sinful, with different texts advocating for sinners to be placed in Christian cemeteries, while others stating that they should be separated. Canon 18.4 even stipulated, though, that husbands and wives could be buried together in his familial cemetery or the church to which we belonged, with the church of a predeceased husband having the choice to be buried at her family cemetery or the church to which she belonged. In all of these cases, we can see that there is an equal emphasis, although there is slightly one more on church-associated cemeteries, but there's still an acceptance as well as promotion to be buried in secular or familial cemeteries as well. In addition to the sites such as St. Michael le Pole in Dublin and St. John's Point in County Down, which have unfurnished graves and Viking Age furnished graves, examples of church-associated cemeteries are throughout Ireland, including Clonmacnoise, Kildare Abbey, Ballycamore, County Mesquith, and Dalkey Island, County Dublin. However, there are also a number of examples of familial or secular cemeteries dating to this time period, including the Rath of Sin and Tara, County Meath, Raystown, County Meath, Cabinteely, County Dublin, Kilshane, County Dublin, and Park Nahone, County Laois. Yet despite the assertion that boundaries were necessary, they could also grow and contract over time, leading the burial to be placed outside of the boundaries. This can be seen at sites such as Church Road, Lusk, County Dublin, and the Monastery of Durrow, County Offaly. Therefore, there isn't quite a steadfast rule as early medieval ecclesiastical leaders or writers may have wanted, with the placement of graves within or outside of cemeteries. Similarly, while burying individuals with grave goods was being dissuaded, their presence can still be seen in familial cemeteries, and animal bones are noted at both familial and ecclesiastical associated cemeteries. While some familial cemeteries were converted into church-associated cemeteries, and the church's power continued to increase, familial cemeteries would be present in Ireland into the 18th century, though not necessarily to the same numbers that they once had. Overall, both types of cemeteries were possible, meaning that secular cemeteries of unfurnished graves and Viking Age furnished graves, or of only Viking Age graves with grave goods, may have been accepted, or at least tolerated due to the political and economic control, particularly in Dublin and de Fliniscary. To a much smaller extent, singular graves have been found in Ireland. Textually, 3 references derived from the 7th century, and in all cases, the individuals were buried where they died. Of particular note are the 2 references, one by Adamon and the other by Mercou, because in both cases, the individuals who died had actually been baptized. In the case of the latter author, he describes the woman's spirit as being placed into, quote, the hands of the angels. While several graves exist archaeologically from the 5th to 7th centuries, and several cannot be dated, only one is approximately concurrent. A mid-adult female was buried near the River Boyne at Fergustown and Ballymacon, County Meath, and dates to the 7th to 9th centuries. The skeletal remains were extended, laid west to east, and placed in a stone-lined grave underneath a low mound, therefore paralleling the practices associated with Christian burial. More isolated graves do exist, but as noted before, they can't be dated. One later example does exist, but it dates to the 15th to 17th century. This means that while there is only 1 or 2 examples, the isolated Viking Age furnished graves are more reflected of a burial practice brought in or utilized as a matter of convenience, rather than one adopted or merged with a pre-existing practice. We cannot be sure if this was due to groups of people moving when the individuals died, or other individuals adopting local practices more quickly, a political or social statement, or any number of reasons. The variety of burial sites, though, reflect the pre-existing variety of sites within the Irish Sea area, and by categorizing the sites, the possible variations occurring among dates, individual grave constructions, grave goods, and grave locations can be compared even further. Although my analysis is still preliminary, I have been able to make some observations among the non-ecclesiastical graves in Ireland, as well as those elsewhere, and how they compare to their ecclesiastical counterparts. For example, graves from both contexts were strategically placed near land routes, water routes, or both, particularly in locations where the graves themselves or the features, such as the church, to which they were associated would have been visible by those traveling. While we cannot be certain if there was any ground features of the burial, above ground features of the burials due to land reuse over time and church reuse, they occupied areas accessible and transportation routes significant in the landscape to local individuals and those of Scandinavian origin, descent, or association. There are also some interesting comparisons regarding grave goods located at ecclesiastical contexts and those at non-ecclesiastical contexts. While several balances for weighing silver have been noted in graves at Island Bridge in County Dublin, they do not appear in graves at any other sites. Similarly, the only non-ecclesiastical context with weight so far is also Island Bridge. St. Michael le Pole, more immediately in Dublin, does have a Viking Age furnished grave with 2 weights, but it is located on the perimeter of the ecclesiastical site. While most sites did not have these balances and weights, coins and hack silver, though these may have been permissible as they appear to be in the form of arm rings, so perhaps considered jewelry by members of the church. These objects were permitted in the church-associated cemeteries, secular cemeteries, and isolated graves. Perhaps due to their heavy weight or connotations, balances and weights may have not been permitted or included in more instances, or perhaps in the case of Island Bridge, it became associated with a trader's burial ground. All of these are speculation as we cannot know their intentions, but it is an interesting decision considering the associations of the Viking Age with trade. However, some commonalities exist among the graves in Ireland. Weapons appear in graves from both contexts, though their placement at ecclesiastical sites appears to vary, with some relegated to the margins in Ireland and others incorporated into the cemeteries. While not necessarily something supported in the textual sources or even seen archaeologically with Irish burials, this may have been an acquisition or due to Scandinavian and Hiberno-Scandinavian rule. The inclusion of animal remains was something already being allowed in certain cemeteries in Ireland, so the presence in 2 graves at the furnished and unfurnished cemetery at Inchicore, County Dublin, one at Island Bridge, and one near the former early medieval ecclesiastical site of Thumie, County Meath, and 2 at South Great George Street, just outside the boundary of the monastery of Dublin, and the latter St. Peter's Church, is not necessarily surprising. Interestingly, the construction of the graves paralleled those in ecclesiastical contexts and those following strictly local burial practices. The majority of the graves are earthen overall, using materials in their respective contexts, many of them using earth, sand, or gravel, but even those that are not earthen have parallels. Charcoal graves like that at Ballyholme, County Down, and wooden coffins like at Inchicore are found throughout Ireland. The one exception is the direct reuse of the Bronze Age burial mound at Croaghan Éireann, County Meath. Prehistoric sites were used in Scandinavia and the Atlantic archipelago for many familial and/or ecclesiastical cemeteries to strengthen ties to notable places in the landscape and to support the notion of burial with one's lineage. While the latter seems unlikely to be the case with Croaghan Éireann, the grave with grave goods underscores the different burial traditions from Scandinavia and more locally, which could be drawn upon different burial traditions, making each grave a unique entity. In comparison to the Scottish graves, of which 2 are located, ecclesiastical sites and 2 are not, some parallels exist to the Irish sites, while some differences remain. For example, like Croaghan Éireann, the grave at Blackern, County Castle Douglas, Cucubrishire, was placed into a pre-existing prehistoric burial monument. Meanwhile, the Viking Age furnished grave at St. Cuthbert's Church on the outskirts of the town of Cucubry included a sword and was placed just inside or just outside the boundary of the early medieval ecclesiastical site. This parallels many of the Viking Age furnished graves at or near ecclesiastical sites, such as those at St. Michael le Pole and the grave on Bride Street, that may have been affiliated with either St. Bridget's Church or St. Michael le Pole. The Viking Age furnished grave of the infant at Whithorn Priory is different, though, having parallels to the Isle of Man and Northwest England. Like the Irish graves, Scottish graves were all located at sites near transportation routes and would have been visibly noticeable in the landscape, which appears to be the case with the Isle of Man in Northwest England. Like the Isle of Man, the known sets of skeletal remains were inhumations, which is different from Northwest England, where the non-ecclesiastical contexts of Heskin in the Forest, Cumbria, and Inskip, Lancashire, had cremation graves from the Viking Age. This analysis is only preliminary, but the effects of each site and region can clearly be seen. Having cataloged the information into a database and done some preliminary study on Ireland and Scotland, my next step is to finish the same process for the sites in England and the Isle of Man. Each shares some similarities with other parts of the Irish Sea area, but they retain characteristics developed from different combinations of people, events, and other factors. Then I will do a statistical analysis comparing the results against each other and the graves at ecclesiastical sites. Once this is completed, the different roles that individual sites, local regions, and the Irish Sea area had in the retention, adoption, and hybridization of certain burial practices, and the varying expressions of power, wealth, and status can be seen more clearly. While we do not know the exact ideology or belief system of the deceased of their kin, numerous decisions had to be made depending upon external and internal factors. Therefore, numerous permutations have resulted from the selection, order, and arrangement of burial practices. While each grave may share traits with others, it is also a unique creation occupying its own time, space, and combination of characteristics. Balancing these concepts is necessary for studying graves, which served as a personal memorial to deceased, but also one that was very public, and intentionally so. In addition, the placement at ecclesiastical and a non-ecclesiastical context was a conscious choice, but that does not necessarily mean it was done in advocacy for or declaration against the church. This can be seen in the graves located in Ireland. While church-associated burial was being increasingly emphasized by clerical and lay writers and was increasingly being used, secular or familial cemeteries were still considered acceptable practice. Singular burials occurred, but they reflect that these Viking Age graves were hybrids, bringing in ideas of placement, either from Scandinavia or other parts of the Viking Age world. The Viking Age was a complex time period in which people were transporting, sharing, adopting, and even hybridizing objects, ideas, beliefs, and practices for a multitude of reasons. Graves encapsulate this movement, and we must not label them as solely Scandinavian and pagan, or study them within their modern-day nation boundaries. Rather, bringing Viking Age graves with grave goods from different areas together shows transportation routes and links between sets of people, but also the impact with which the local or nearby environments had on the deceased and their kin when choosing how to construct, what to include in, and where to place the grave. Thank you, and also may the fourth be with you.
Thank you, Danica, for that reference at the end. If you can downsize your screen, we will. We've got time for some very quick questions. Sorry, I'm just struggling here because I haven't got my glasses on. I'm very struck with some of the things you said, actually, in that there are some interesting parallels with the 7th century in England, but I'm not going to get distracted by that. Right, I have a question here from Stefan. Do you think that because during this period Christianity was more a political statement rather than a spiritual one, grave goods were tolerated, or perhaps recent converts wanted to hedge their bets in the afterlife by having Christian burials but keeping their grave goods to honor their previous pagan beliefs?
I think it could be either, or it could be both. We're not quite sure why they decided to make the decisions that they did, but clearly they had a lot to consider within everything going on, whether both from the past and the present and everything that was going around them.
No, it's a very difficult question to answer. I can appreciate that. If anyone else has any questions, do pop them in the box. We've got a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask a question I suspect I know the answer to, but I think it may be worth asking. I mean, a lot of your sort of the evidence you built up is based on the material culture, the burial practice, that sort of thing, which is understandable. Has there been kind of any more recent scientific analysis of, say, the individuals who have been buried? I'm thinking about isotope analysis or that sort of thing, to think about whether we can see different groups, that sort of thing.
There has been done, not in my particular area. The isotopic analysis has primarily been in relation to graves located at St. Patrick's Isle on the Isle of Man. So there's been some evidence that there, as well as within Dublin itself, I realized at St. Michael of Pole it was done, that the evidence was that they were there as necessarily more recently spent a significant period of time, but their childhood was spent elsewhere. As to where that elsewhere was, the isotopic analysis can't necessarily narrow that down. So we know that they're coming in, but they could have been coming in from across the Irish Sea.
No, that's I fully understand that. We have a Manx question next. Well, from the Isle of Man, I should say. Danica, have you spotted any correlation in the source of grave goods with secular or ecclesiastical burials?
I've done that I have not yet done that with completely with the secular sites, but I have done it with the ecclesiastical sites, where you do have a tendency, the grave goods tend to be located more within the Irish Sea area than actually from Scandinavia or externally. So a lot of times the word insular is used to describe the object, which is what I'm basing it on. Or there are a lot of objects that are based on Dublin types. So in Ireland, you tend to find a lot of objects from Ireland. And from the Isle of Man, they tend to either be local or derived from Ireland and then in Northwest England, they tend to actually be from Northwest England.
Okay, no, that's fascinating. Brilliant. Well, thank you. Unless anyone has a last minute urgent question, I'm very conscious we were late starting, and I don't want to keep people longer than we need to. And apologies again for the technical gremlins that got into our Zoom feed, but we got there in the end. What I would suggest is, if anyone missed the beginning of the lecture, it will be going online on our YouTube channel, so you can re-watch it, at your leisure. So apologies again for that. The only thing obviously to thank our speaker, Danica, for a fascinating talk about an area of the world I know nothing. So that's why I wasn't able to ask an incisive question. And just to let you know that our next speaker, and hopefully without technical glitch, will be on the 7th of June. And we have Dr. Meg Bernstein talking about visualizing purgatory in medieval England. So that's that's going to be rather interesting, I suspect. So hopefully we'll see you all then as well. But thank you again, Danica, for your talk, and thank you all for attending. And finally, apologies for the slight delay to everything, but we'll see you hopefully next month. Okay, bye.